All right, so we're going to begin chapter 15, looking at integrative functions. So our sensory receptors help us understand the world around us, right? And what we're actually able to perceive is going to vary, as the state of our nervous system changes. So how we perceive a stimulus, it's going to reflect activity that's going on in our cerebral cortex. But sometimes that activity is not what it's supposed to be. Sometimes it's inappropriate. And here, when I say inappropriate, I mean maybe isn't what should happen normally. All right, receptors. So you've got sensory receptors. All right, and these are specialized cells or processes. When you stimulate them, it's going to send some sensory information to your central nervous system. You have sensory receptors that are going to interact with your nervous system, as well as the internal environment going on inside your body and the external environment outside your body. Okay, a term you should know is transduction, and that's basically just means that you're having a sensory receptor and it's going to detect some stimulus. Okay, and it's going to translate that stimulus into an action potential. Okay, we've learned about that already, right? So it's just giving it another name. All right, general senses, things like pain, touch, vibration, pressure, proprioception. Okay, and proprioception, really, we're talking about kind of position. Okay, so where is something where it's supposed to be physically? All right, so receptors for those sensations are going to be distributed throughout your body. Your special senses, things like smell or olfaction, taste or gustation, vision or sight, balance or equilibrium, and hearing. All right, so these receptors for these senses are typically more complex than the receptors for general senses, okay? Because in many cases, they're having to do multiple things, not just one thing, okay? So the receptors for these special senses are in specialized areas, and we call those sense organs, right? So information from those receptors is going to travel to certain areas in your cerebral cortex, like your auditory cortex and your visual cortex. So one of the things that makes receptors work is their specificity, okay? So some receptors are very general, others are very specific. So your receptor specificity is going to allow the different receptors to respond to a specific stimulus. So the specificity can result from structures in that receptor cell. So maybe the receptor cell has a certain structure, so it makes it very specific. Could also be presence of what we call accessory cells or structures that are shielding that receptor cell from other stimuli. Okay, so they're getting in the way of stimuli that don't fit, binding. So the simplest receptors are just going to be free nerve endings that have no protection from accessory structures. Okay. The term that we use is receptive field. And here it's an area that you monitor with a single receptor cell. Okay. All right, so arriving stimulus can be in different forms. Could be some physical force, could be some chemical gets dissolved in the area, could be some sound, it could be a light. Okay, now sensory information has to travel to the central nervous system via some kind of action potential. Okay, you have the electrical sense, events that happen. Okay, all right. Show you an image here. All right. So just want to give you a kind of an overview. So remember, we have the arriving stimulus. We get some depolarization in the sensory receptor. Remember the graded responses, right? That's got to be enough to trigger an action potential. So, all right, then we got to generate an action potential. If you get the stimulus depolarizing the receptor cell to threshold, you get that action potential. Okay, and then that action potential gets propagated, goes to the central nervous system for processing. Okay, now there's got to be some response. It could be an involuntary motor pathway, and it could be an immediate response. Okay, so it says processing centers in your spinal cord and your brainstem could direct an immediate reflex response even before those sensations reach your cerebral cortex. All right, you could also have more of a voluntary pathway. So tells you with perception, most of the sensations are not related to your primary somatosensory cortex, but some are. Okay, but for the motor pathway, which is voluntary, it's not immediate, but it can moderate, enhance, or supplement the relatively simple and involuntary reflexive response. So yeah, and these can be happening simultaneously. Okay, so you can get some involuntary response, but you can also have the voluntary response. Okay, which will be typically more exaggerated. Okay, but just kind of wanted to give you that as a big picture as we go through the chapter. All right, so let's talk a little bit about transduction. Transduction's got 3 steps. First step, your stimulus has to alter your transmembrane potential in the membrane of the receptor, right? Okay, you gotta alter that transmembrane potential. So what is the receptor potential? Well, it's a change in that transmembrane potential accompanying the stimulation. Okay, it could be depolarization, could be hyperpolarization, depending what type of stimulus it is. All right, and the potential change is graded. So if you have a stronger stimulus, you get a longer receptor potential. The second step, your receptor potential is going to directly or indirectly affect some sensory neuron. So what's happening at the receptor influences what happens at the neuron. You get what's called a generator potential. It's a membrane depolarization leads to an action potential in that sensory neuron. Okay, so it should sound familiar to what we learned about before with steps in generating an action potential. All right, so you get sensations like hearing, equilibrium, vision, taste, provided by specialized receptor cells that are communicating with sensory neurons across chemical synapses. Creates a change in membrane potential, and it can alter the rate of release of the neurotransmitter at the synapse. Okay, in your third step, you get action potentials traveling to your central nervous system along an afferent fiber. Remember, afferent goes from the sensory neuron to the central nervous system. All right, so when a generator potential appears, you get action potentials in your afferent fiber. And then arriving information is going to be processed and interpreted by your central nervous system. And that happens at both the subconscious and the conscious levels. All right, so what I'd like for you to do now is to talk with your partner about the steps of transduction. You can do this at home as well. Okay, so let's talk about how you interpret, or your brain and your nerves interpret sensory information, and secondary information in particular. So sensory information that arrives at your central nervous system is going to get routed based on the nature of the stimulus as well as its location. So in a sense, your central nervous system is a bit of a switchboard, okay? So you, based on what type of message it is, it's going to determine where it's going to go once it gets to the central nervous system. So the axons along those sensory pathways are going to relay information from one receptor to another, one point to another point. Could be to another neuron somewhere in a specific, in the cerebral cortex. All right, term you should know is a labeled line, and is a link between receptors and the cortical neuron. And it's going to consist of different axons that carry information about one modality, one type of stimulus. Okay. Could be sound, light, pressure, or touch. So the identity of that sensation is going to be indicated by the labeled line that's carrying action potentials into your brain and spinal cord. Okay, so what indicates the intensity of the stimulus? Well, it could be the pattern of the action potentials. It could be the frequency of the action potentials. Another term you need to know is sensory coding. So with sensory coding, here you're translating complex sensory information. You're getting meaningful patterns of action potentials. So you're basically converting sensory information into action potentials. Now, what we have, we call tonic receptors, and they're always in a state of sending signals to your brain and your spinal cord. Okay, you also have phasic receptors, and they're only active in certain phases, right? And they become active only when the conditions they're monitoring change. Okay, more about processing and adaptation. So adaptation just means, in this case, reducing the sensitivity once a stimulus is present all the time. So it's kind of like, that people talk about, addictive drugs, people that are on those, that they get stimulated from that, but getting the same stimulus over time, they don't get the same response. Okay. So that's sort of a negative example, but I mean, a general example might be, let's just say who in here is a big coffee drinker? Anybody a big coffee drinker? Okay. So anybody gets to the point where you go from getting coffee to like make you really excited to getting coffee just keeps you just normal, right? Same kind of concept, reduction in sensitivity. So peripheral adaptation. So when you get different receptors or sensory neurons altering their levels of activity, we call that peripheral adaptation. And it's going to reduce how much information gets to your brain, your spinal cord. Okay. So receptors that act quickly are considered phasic. So the receptor is going to have a strong response initially, but after that, the activity along the connected afferent fiber is going to start declining. Okay, example, there's temperature receptors. So, when let's just say you're in a really, really cold room or really, really hot room, or you go outside, it's really hot, you turn on the, shower and the water's really, really cold or really, really hot, you have an initial reaction, but you don't have that same reaction over time. It tends to not be as strong, right? So the more slowly adapting receptors are going to be more tonic, okay? And they don't show much peripheral adaptation, right? So pain receptors, if you feel pain, you generally just feel pain, right? So they tend to stay in that constant state. And that's actually a good thing, because if you didn't feel the pain, you wouldn't necessarily get it taken care of, okay? All right. So we talked about peripheral adaptation. Now let's talk about central adaptation. So with central adaptation, it's happening in the central nervous system along your sensory pathways, okay? Whereas peripheral is kind of out in the actual sensory neurons, okay? And it's generally involving inhibition of these sensory pathways. Central adaptation happens at the subconscious level. It's going to decrease the amount of information that gets to your cerebral cortex, because it's generally involved in inhibition. All right, so most of your incoming information is processed in centers along your spinal cord or on the brainstem. Now, most of that information is essentially going to get filtered, like where most of it doesn't continue to pass through. Only about 1% is going to reach your cerebral cortex, other conscious awareness, okay? So your spinal cord and your brainstem is basically a filter to decide, is this really important enough to get to the brain? Like, can we handle this on our own, right? If they can, they do. If it needs to go to the brain, then it goes through. All right. So output from these higher centers can increase the sensitivity of the receptor, or it could facilitate transmission along that sensory pathway. But it could also inhibit transmission along the sensory pathway, okay? All right, so let's take time and look at an image. All right, so here's a view of what happens with a tonic receptor. So you get your stimulus normal, and then you increase what's going on there with the stimulus. You get an increased frequency of action potentials, and you get essentially a higher frequency of action potential still over time. Okay, not necessarily as high as it was at first, but you do get an increase. Now with phasic receptors, when you increase the stimulus, when you have a change in the stimulus, you get a change in the frequency of action potentials. Okay, when you decrease that stimulus, you get a change in the frequency of action potentials, but then after that, it goes away. It's a very short impact, okay? All right. So let's talk for a minute with your partner about central processing and adaptation. You can do this at home as well. Okay, so this time you can go ahead and do your exit ticket with your clear point and your muddy point. And we will pick up here at general senses in the next video.